Deep in the Montana wilderness, where cell towers don't reach, and the nearest neighbor is 20 miles away, Jake Razor Morrison swung his axe into another log. The charred foundation of his grandfather's cabin lay scattered around him like broken promises. 3 months ago, he'd been the Hells Angels' most feared debt collector, rolling through Los Angeles with a crew that controlled half the city's underground. Then his own brothers turned on him. They took his bike, his money, his reputation, and burned down the only place that ever felt like home. Now, with calloused hands that once dealt violence, he was building something pure, something his grandfather would have been proud of. The old man had taught him that a man's worth wasn't measured in fear or money, but in what he could create with his own 2 hands. But as Jake hammered the first beam into place, he spotted fresh tire tracks in the mud, deep treads, multiple bikes. His past had found him in paradise, and this time there was nowhere left to run. The question wasn't whether they'd come for him, it was whether the man he was becoming could survive the man he used to be. Jake dropped the hammer and crouched beside the tire tracks, his fingers tracing the deep grooves carved into the soft earth. Harley Davidsons, no doubt about it. 3, maybe 4 bikes based on the pattern. The tracks were fresh, made sometime in the last few hours while he'd been working on the cabin's frame. His hand instinctively moved to his hip where his Colt. .45 used to rest, but found only empty space. He'd thrown the gun into the lake 2 weeks ago, along with his colors and everything else that connected him to the life he'd left behind. Now he wished he'd kept it. The wind shifted through the pine trees, carrying with it the distant rumble of approaching engines. Jake's blood turned to ice water. They'd found him faster than he'd expected. Part of him had hoped the club would just write him off as dead and move on, but he should have known better. Tony Sledge Martinelli never let debts go unpaid, especially not the kind Jake had left behind. Jake sprinted toward the old tool shed, the only structure that had survived the fire. His grandfather's hunting rifle was still there, wrapped in oiled canvas and hidden beneath loose floorboards. The Winchester Model 70 felt foreign in his hands after years of carrying modern weapons, but it would have to do. The engine noise grew louder, echoing off the mountain walls. Jake counted the bikes by sound, 4, just like the tracks suggested. He chambered around and took position behind a stack of lumber, his heart hammering against his ribs. The first bike emerged from the tree line like a metallic predator, chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun. Jake recognized the rider immediately, Marcus Bones Rodriguez, his former sergeant-at-arms, the man who'd been his closest friend for 8 years. The man who'd held him down while Tony's crew worked him over with tire irons. 3 more bikes followed, their riders wearing the distinctive skull patches of the Hells Angels Los Angeles chapter. Jake didn't recognize the others, fresh blood, probably brought in to replace the members who'd died in the war that led to his exile. Bones killed his engine and removed his helmet, revealing a face that bore fresh scars Jake didn't remember. The betrayal had cost everyone something. "Jake!" Bones called out, his voice carrying across the clearing. "We know you're here, brother. Saw the smoke from your fire 3 miles out." Jake remained silent, finger resting on the Winchester's trigger. He had 5 rounds in the magazine and 1 in the chamber, 6 shots for 4 men. The math worked if he didn't miss. "Look, man," Bones continued, dismounting his bike and raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "We didn't come here to finish what we started in LA. Things have changed. Tony's dead." That last statement hit Jake like a physical blow. Tony Martinelli had been the club's president for 15 years, the man who'd ordered Jake's beating and exile, the man who'd burned down the cabin out of pure spite. "Happened 2 weeks ago," Bones shouted. "Mexicans hit our clubhouse, took out Tony and half the executive board. The club's falling apart, Jake. We need you back." Jake's grip on the rifle tightened. He'd heard this song before. The club always needed its most effective killers when times got tough, but they'd made their choice when they chose Tony's paranoid leadership over Jake's loyalty. "That's real convenient timing," Jake finally called back, not revealing his position. "Tony dies and suddenly I'm welcome home?" Bones laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Home? Brother, there is no home. The clubhouse is gone. Most of our territory's been carved up by the Mongols and the outlaws. We're running on fumes and prayers." The wind picked up, rustling through the half-built cabin frame. Jake thought about his grandfather's words. A man's worth isn't measured in fear or money. But some debts could only be paid in blood, and his former brothers had spilled plenty of his. The drive from Billings to the cabin took Jake through country that looked like God had run out of ideas halfway through creation. Mile after mile of rolling hills stretched toward mountains that seemed to recede with each turn of the highway. His Harley's engine had given up outside Great Falls, leaving him with a beat-up Ford pickup he'd bought for cash from a mechanic who didn't ask questions. The truck's radio crackled with static and fragments of talk radio, voices arguing about politics and weather patterns that meant nothing to him now. He'd left that world behind, the world where people cared about tomorrow's forecast because they had plans, because they believed the future was something you could count on. Jake's ribs ached with every pothole, reminders of Mickey Torino's final conversation. 3 broken ribs, a concussion, and a message delivered with Louisville Slugger precision. The Montana Charter was done, and so was he. 23 years of brotherhood, reduced to bloodstains on a warehouse floor and a train ticket west. The turnoff came up faster than he remembered. A dirt road that wound through stands of lodgepole pine, climbing steadily until the trees opened into the meadow where his grandfather's cabin had stood for 40 years, where it should have stood. Jake killed the engine and sat in the sudden silence, staring at the blackened foundation stones and the brick chimney that rose from the ash like a tombstone. The fire had happened 3 months ago, according to the sheriff's report he'd finally gotten around to reading. Electrical fault, they figured. No one had been inside. He climbed out of the truck, his boots crunching on gravel and debris. The smell hit him first, that distinctive char of burned wood and melted plastic, with an underlying sweetness that might have been his grandfather's books or might have been something worse. The metal roof had collapsed inward, creating a shallow bowl filled with the remains of a life he'd barely been part of for the last 2 decades. Jake walked the perimeter of the foundation, cataloguing damage and memories in equal measure. The kitchen had been there, where he'd learned to make coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The living room there, dominated by a stone fireplace where his grandfather would sit with his pipe and his silence, comfortable with both. The old man had died 2 years ago. Natural causes, the lawyer had said when he'd called about the inheritance. Jake had been in the middle of a debt collection in Spokane, breaking a restaurant owner's fingers with methodical precision. He'd missed the funeral, sent flowers, told himself he'd visit the cabin when things settled down. Things never settled down in his world. They just got louder until the noise drowned out everything else. Now Walter Crowkiller was gone, and his cabin was ash, and Jake was standing in the ruins wondering what the hell he was supposed to do with 20 acres of Montana wilderness and a bank account that wouldn't stretch to cover a decent motorcycle, let alone rebuilding. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals with lazy precision. Jake watched it hunt, remembering his grandfather's lessons about patience and observation. Everything's got a pattern, the old man used to say. Animals, weather, people, you just got to watch long enough to see it. The pattern of Jake's life had led him here, to this burned foundation in the middle of nowhere. Maybe that meant something, maybe it meant nothing. But it was what he had. He walked back to the truck and pulled out the manila folder the lawyer had given him. Insurance papers, property deeds, a letter in his grandfather's careful handwriting. Jake had read it once, quickly, in a bar in Billings. Now he opened it again. "Jacob," it began. No dear, no pleasantries. That was Walter's way. "If you're reading this, I'm dead, and you're probably wondering why I left you this place. Truth is, I always figured you'd need somewhere to go when that life caught up with you. Cabin's nothing special, but the land is good. Clean water, clean air, clean slate if you want it. Foundation solid. Built it myself in '73. Should last another 100 years if you treat it right. Do what you want with it. But remember, sometimes a man needs to build something instead of just tearing things down." The letter was signed with his grandfather's initials, nothing more. Jake folded the paper and looked out across the meadow. Evening was coming on, painting the mountains purple and gold. In a few hours it would be full dark, and he'd have to decide whether to drive back to town for a motel room or sleep in the truck. He thought about Mickey Torino's Louisville Slugger. He thought about 23 years of brotherhood ending in betrayal and blood. He thought about his grandfather's hands, building this foundation stone by stone. The hawk had found something in the tall grass. Jake watched it drop from the sky like a guided missile, precise and deadly and completely committed to its choice. The smell of charred wood and ash still clung to everything, even 3 days after Jake had started clearing the debris. His hands were black with soot, cuts from twisted metal and splintered beams mapping his palms like a roadmap of destruction. The serpents had been thorough. They'd made sure nothing recognizable remained of the place where he'd spent the best summers of his childhood. Jake dragged another beam from what used to be the main room, muscles screaming in protest. His ribs, still tender from the beating, sent sharp reminders with every movement, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache that had settled in his chest since Marcus died in his arms on that warehouse floor. The old man's truck wheezed to a stop behind him, and Jake didn't need to turn around to know Earl Hutchins was climbing out with his usual grunt and complaint about his arthritis. Earl had been his grandfather's neighbor for 40 years, living in the only other cabin within 5 miles of this remote stretch of Montana wilderness. "You're working yourself to death, boy," Earl called out, his boots crunching through the debris field. "Ain't no shame in hiring some help." Jake straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm. "Money's tight." "Earl, I got nothing but time. Been meaning to pay my respects anyway." Earl surveyed the destruction, shaking his weathered head. "Your granddad would have hunted down whoever did this with a shotgun and a mean disposition." The mention of his grandfather sparked something Jake had been trying to avoid, the weight of expectation, of legacy, of being the last Miller to carry the old man's name. Samuel Miller had been a force of nature, a man who'd carved out his piece of the world with nothing but determination and an unwillingness to bend to anyone. "He ever mention anything about hiding things?" Jake asked, the question slipping out before he could stop himself. Earl's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline. "Sam? Hell yes. That man didn't trust banks, government, or anybody else with what was his. Why?" Jake nodded toward the foundation where he'd found the metal box. He'd spent hours trying to pry it open, but whatever his grandfather had used to seal it had defeated every tool Jake could find in his truck. Earl followed him over to where the box sat on a relatively clean piece of concrete. It was roughly the size of a cigar box, made of some kind of treated steel that had survived the fire without so much as a scorch mark. No visible hinges, no obvious lock mechanism, just smooth metal with what looked like a combination dial built flush into the surface. "Well, I'll be damned," Earl muttered, kneeling down for a closer look. "Never seen anything like this before, but it's got Sam's fingerprints all over it. Man loved his puzzles and secrets." Jake had tried every combination he could think of, birthdays, anniversary dates, even the coordinates of the cabin. Nothing worked. The dial would turn freely, but the box remained sealed tight. "You try his service number?" Earl asked. "What service number?" Earl looked surprised. "Boy, your grandfather never told you? Sam Miller served 3 tours in Vietnam, Special Forces, came back in '72 with decorations he never talked about and shadows in his eyes that never quite went away." Jake stared at the old man. In all his childhood visits, all the stories and conversations, his grandfather had never once mentioned military service. He'd always claimed he was just a logger who got lucky with some land investments. "He made me swear never to tell you kids," Earl continued. "Said he wanted you to remember him for the man he became, not the soldier he had to be. But hell, he's gone now, and secrets don't keep the dead warm." Earl's weathered fingers traced the outline of the combination dial. "If I had to guess, this box contains whatever Sam brought back from that war, things he couldn't let go of but couldn't bear to look at either." Jake felt the world shift slightly beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about his grandfather, the quiet wisdom, the gentle hands that taught him to fish and hunt, the man who'd shown him that strength didn't always have to come with violence, had been built on carefully constructed lies. What was his service number? Earl closed his eyes, thinking. 557982. Repeated it often enough when he'd had too much whiskey and started talking about ghosts. Jake's fingers trembled slightly as he turned the dial. Each number clicked into place, with a soft, precise sound. When the final digit aligned, something deep within the box mechanism gave a barely audible whisper of released pressure. The lid opened on silent hinges, revealing contents that would change everything Jake thought he knew about his family's past and his own future. The morning light filtered through the makeshift tarp Jake had strung between two standing beams, casting dancing shadows across the debris field that had once been his grandfather's kitchen. 3 days of sorting through the wreckage had yielded little more than melted silverware and the charred skeleton of an old wood stove, but Jake pressed on with methodical determination. The physical labor kept his mind from wandering to darker places. He was prying up a section of collapsed flooring when his crowbar struck something that rang like metal against metal. Not the dull thud of a nail or the scrape of charred wood, but a clear, hollow sound that made him pause. Jake dropped to his knees and cleared away more debris, his fingers finding the edge of what felt like a steel plate embedded in the floor. 20 minutes of careful excavation revealed a rectangular metal door, maybe 3 feet by 2, fitted flush with the subflooring. The steel bore scorch marks but had held against the fire's fury. Jake ran his hands along the edges until he found a recessed handle. The door was locked, but the mechanism felt substantial, built to last. He sat back on his heels, staring at the hidden compartment. In all his childhood visits to the cabin, Grandpa Ray had never mentioned anything like this. The old man had been full of stories about his logging days, his time in Korea, the various adventures that had filled his 73 years, but he'd never said a word about hiding places under his kitchen floor. Jake retrieved a pry bar from his truck and worked it into the gap around the door. The lock was solid, but the fire had weakened the surrounding wood. After several minutes of careful pressure, the locking mechanism gave way with a sharp crack. The door swung open, to reveal a steel-lined compartment about 4 feet deep. A wooden ladder was bolted to one side, its rungs disappearing into darkness below. Jake grabbed a flashlight from his toolkit and shined it down into the space. The beam illuminated a small underground room, maybe 8 feet square, with concrete walls and a dry floor. Wooden shelves lined 3 walls, and Jake could make out the shapes of boxes, containers, and what looked like filing cabinets in the shadows below. He tested the ladder rungs, found them solid, and climbed down into his grandfather's secret room. The air smelled of old wood and gun oil. Jake's flashlight beam swept across the shelves, revealing an inventory that made him whistle low under his breath. Boxes of ammunition were stacked with military precision. 3 rifles hung on wall mounts, their metal surfaces gleaming with careful maintenance. A row of handguns rested in foam-lined cases. But it was the filing cabinets that drew his attention. 4 grey metal drawers, each marked with years spanning from 1975 to 2015. Jake pulled open the top drawer and found it packed with manila folders, each labeled with names, dates, and locations. His flashlight beam caught fragments of text as he rifled through the files, surveillance photographs, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes in his grandfather's careful script. He pulled out a folder marked Kowalski, 1987, and opened it on top of the cabinet. Inside were photographs of a thin man with nervous eyes, copies of police reports, and several pages of notes detailing the man's daily routine, associates, and habits. At the bottom of the folder was a newspaper clipping with the headline, "Local Businessman Found Dead in Lake." Jake's hands trembled slightly as he reached for another folder. This one was labeled Morrison, 1992, and contained similar materials, photos, surveillance notes, and a final newspaper clipping about a fatal car accident on a mountain road. He opened drawer after drawer, finding dozens of similar files. Each one told the same story: detailed surveillance, careful documentation, and a final news report of an untimely death. The victims seemed to have nothing in common except for one detail that appeared in every file. They had all been involved in some way with drug trafficking, human smuggling, or other crimes that traditional law enforcement had failed to address. At the bottom of the final drawer, Jake found a leather journal filled with his grandfather's handwriting. The first entry was dated March 15, 1975. The law failed Sarah Morrison today. The man who sold drugs to kids outside her school walked free on a technicality. Judge said the search was illegal. Maybe it was, but some things can't wait for perfect justice. Jake sank into a folding chair tucked in the corner of the room, the journal heavy in his hands. Page after page revealed his grandfather's transformation from grieving citizen to methodical vigilante. Ray had taken it upon himself to eliminate threats that the legal system couldn't touch, developing an elaborate network of information sources and establishing himself as an invisible force for his own brand of justice. The final entry was dated just 6 months before the old man's death. Jake's coming to visit next week. Good boy, but he's chosen a hard path with that motorcycle club. I worry about him. Maybe someday he'll understand that sometimes a man has to make his own justice in this world. The morning sun cast long shadows through the skeletal remains of what had once been the cabin's back porch. Marcus sat on an overturned milk crate, nursing his second cup of coffee and studying the metal box he'd pulled from the ruins the day before. His hands still bore the grime and cuts from yesterday's digging, but the contents of that box had kept him awake most of the night. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, he'd found 3 items that made no sense together. A detailed map of the surrounding mountains, marked with symbols he didn't recognize. A ledger filled with his grandfather's cramped handwriting, documenting what appeared to be regular payments from someone called Mountain View Development. And most puzzling of all, a collection of photographs showing men in expensive suits standing beside equipment he couldn't identify, all taken somewhere in these very hills. The photographs were dated from the months before his grandfather's death. In several, Marcus could make out the same face, a thin man with silver hair and cold eyes who appeared to be giving orders. The others deferred to him, their body language speaking of hierarchy and serious business. Whatever they were doing up here, it wasn't logging or hunting. Marcus spread the map across his makeshift table, weighing down the corners with rocks. The symbols his grandfather had drawn were clustered in 3 distinct areas, all within a 5-mile radius of the cabin. Some were marked with dates, others with cryptic notations like night runs and heavy trucks after midnight. One location, circled in red ink, bore a single word: proof. The ledger told a different story. Page after page documented monthly payments of $5,000, always on the 15th, always in cash. The entries went back 3 years, right up until the month his grandfather died. The final entry was different. No amount listed, just a single line in increasingly shaky handwriting: "They know I know. M gets everything." A chill ran down Marcus's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. His grandfather had been trying to tell him something, had known he might not survive to explain it in person. The old man had always been paranoid about strangers, about people asking too many questions about the land. Marcus had chalked it up to the natural suspicion of someone who'd lived alone in the mountains for decades. Now he wondered if that paranoia had been justified. The sound of an engine approaching made him quickly gather the documents and photos. A black SUV wound its way up the dirt road, moving slowly, deliberately. Marcus slipped the materials back into the metal box and shoved it behind a pile of salvaged lumber. His hand instinctively moved to the .45, tucked into his waistband. The SUV stopped 50 yards from the cabin site. 2 men got out, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other lean with the fluid movements of someone comfortable with violence. They wore civilian clothes, but something about their bearing screamed military or law enforcement. The tall one raised a hand in greeting. "Morning," he called out. "Sorry to bother you. I'm Agent Reeves. This is Agent Chen. We're with the DEA." He held up a badge wallet, too distant for Marcus to make out the details. "Mind if we ask you a few questions?" Marcus kept his expression neutral, his hands visible. "Free country. What's this about?" The agents approached slowly, their eyes taking in everything. The burned cabin, the scattered debris, Marcus himself. Agent Chen had the look of someone who missed nothing, his gaze lingering on the fresh tool marks where Marcus had been digging. "We're investigating some unusual activity in this area," Reeves said. "Drug trafficking specifically. We understand your grandfather lived here until recently. He died 6 months ago. I'm just cleaning up the property." "Our condolences," Chen said, his tone suggesting anything but sympathy. "Did he ever mention seeing anything strange up here? Unusual traffic? People who didn't belong?" Marcus considered his words carefully. He was pretty much a hermit, didn't talk much about neighbors or visitors. The agents exchanged a glance. Reeves pulled out a photograph, one of the men from his grandfather's collection. "Ever see this man before?" Marcus looked at the photo, his face showing nothing despite the recognition that hit him like a punch to the gut. It was the silver-haired man from several of his grandfather's pictures, the one who seemed to be in charge. "No. Should I have?" "Probably not," Chen said. "He tends to keep a low profile. Name's Victor Crane. He owns Mountain View Development." The name from the ledger. Marcus felt the pieces of something large and dangerous beginning to align, but kept his expression blank. Never heard of them. Reeves handed him a business card. "If you find anything while cleaning up, anything that seems out of place or suspicious, give us a call. We'd appreciate the cooperation." They walked back toward their vehicle, but Chen turned back once more. "Nice work on the cleanup, by the way. Looks like you've been digging pretty thoroughly." Marcus watched until their SUV disappeared down the mountain road, then retrieved the metal box. His grandfather hadn't just been collecting evidence of something illegal. He'd been building a case against people with enough reach to bring federal agents to this remote mountainside. The question was whether those agents were hunting the same prey or if Marcus had just painted a target on his own back. The morning brought Jake face to face with a problem he hadn't anticipated: money. The contractor's estimate for the foundation repair alone would drain most of his remaining cash, and that didn't include materials for the walls, roof, or any of the interior work. He sat on the tailgate of his truck, staring at the numbers scrawled on the back of a receipt, doing mental calculations that all led to the same conclusion: he was going to need a job. The irony wasn't lost on him. For 15 years, money had come from violence, intimidation, and the club's various enterprises. Now he needed legitimate work, something he hadn't done since high school when he'd helped his grandfather split firewood for the neighbors. The skills he'd accumulated in his adult life weren't exactly resume material. He drove into Millfield with no particular destination in mind, just hoping something would present itself. The town looked different in daylight, smaller, more weathered, like an old photograph left too long in the sun. Main Street stretched 3 blocks, lined with brick buildings that had probably looked the same for 50 years. A hardware store, a diner, a bank, and a handful of other businesses that served the ranching community. Jake parked outside Murphy's Hardware and walked in, the bell above the door announcing his arrival. The place smelled of oil, sawdust, and metal, honest smells that reminded him of his grandfather's workshop. An older man with silver hair and calloused hands looked up from behind the counter. "Help you find something?" "Actually, I'm looking for work. Jake Morrison. I'm fixing up my grandfather's place out on Willow Creek Road. Old Hank Morrison's cabin." The man's expression shifted, recognition dawning in his eyes. "I'll be damned. You're Hank's grandson. Haven't seen you since you were knee-high. Tom Murphy." He extended a weathered hand. "Heard you were back in town. Sorry about Hank, he was good people." Jake shook his hand, grateful for the neutral tone. No judgment, no questions about where he'd been or what he'd been doing. "Thank you," he was. "So, you're rebuilding the place? Heard it got pretty torn up in that fire last winter." "Yeah, it's going to be a project. Which is why I need work. I can swing a hammer, lift heavy things, and I learn fast. Not much else to put on the resume." Tom studied him for a moment, taking in the tattoos visible on Jake's forearms, the hard edges that 15 years in the club had carved into his features. But there must have been something of his grandfather in him still, because Tom nodded slowly. "Matter of fact, I might have something. My delivery driver just quit, moved to Billings for a better job. Mostly it's hauling lumber and supplies to job sites, some assembly work, helping contractors with whatever they need. Pay's not great, but it's honest work." "That sounds perfect. Can you drive a truck? Big one, not just a pickup." "Yeah, I can handle it." Tom pulled out a business card and scribbled something on the back. "Tell you what, there's a job tomorrow morning. Contractor needs a load of lumber delivered to a build site about 20 miles out, then help with framing if you're up for it. $12 an hour plus overtime if it runs long. You interested?" Jake took the card, feeling something like relief wash over him. "Absolutely. What time?" 7 a.m. sharp. "Trucks loaded?" and ready to go. They shook hands again, and Jake felt the weight of legitimacy settling on his shoulders. It was strange how such a simple transaction, offering labor for honest pay, could feel so foreign after all these years. He spent the rest of the day driving around the area, reacquainting himself with roads he'd traveled as a kid. The landscape hadn't changed much. Rolling hills dotted with cattle, fence lines stretching to the horizon, the mountains rising like ancient sentinels in the distance. It was peaceful in a way that made his chest tight with something between longing and grief. As evening approached, he found himself at the cemetery where his grandfather was buried. The headstone was simple granite, just dates and a name. Jake knelt and brushed away the dried leaves that had accumulated since his last visit. "Got a job today, Grandpa," he said quietly. "Nothing fancy, but it's a start. Murphy's Hardware. You remember Tom Murphy? Says you were good people." The wind picked up, rustling through the cottonwoods that bordered the cemetery. Jake stayed there until the sun touched the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded him of the fires he used to help his grandfather tend on cold winter nights. When he finally stood to leave, he felt lighter somehow, as if sharing the small victory had made it more real. Tomorrow he would start over, one honest day's work at a time. The man he'd been was still there, would always be there, but maybe, just maybe, he could build something better on top of those broken foundations. The sound of an engine cut through the morning silence like a blade. Jake's hand moved instinctively to the hammer at his belt as he looked up from the foundation stones he'd been setting. Through the trees, chrome-caught sunlight, a motorcycle, definitely a Harley, moving slow and deliberate up the dirt road. He'd been expecting this moment for 3 weeks now. Part of him was almost relieved it had finally come. The bike emerged from the tree line, and Jake recognized both machine and rider immediately. Diesel Murphy, prospect for the Angels, riding his pristine street glide like it was worth more than most people's houses, which it probably was. The kid had always been flashy, more interested in looking the part than earning it. Diesel killed the engine and sat for a moment, hands still on the grips, studying the construction site. Jake stayed where he was, crouched beside the foundation, letting the kid make the first move. Old habits. Never show your hand until you know what game you're playing. "Well, I'll be damned," Diesel finally called out, pulling off his helmet to reveal the same cocky grin Jake remembered. Jake fucking Morrison, playing house in the woods. Diesel. Jake straightened slowly, keeping his movements casual. Long way from the clubhouse. Not as far as you might think. The prospect swung his leg over the bike, his leather couté creaking in the quiet air. The patches were all wrong, too new, too clean. This wasn't a man who'd earned his place through blood and time. Club's been wondering where their favorite enforcer disappeared to. "Former enforcer," Jake corrected. "I'm retired." Diesel laughed, a harsh sound that sent a crow cawing from the nearby pines. "That's not how retirement works in our world, brother. You know that better than most." Jake did know. He'd delivered that exact message to more than a few men who'd thought they could just walk away. The Angels didn't give gold watches and pension plans. They gave shallow graves to those who knew too much and tried to leave. "What do you want, Diesel?" "Direct. I always liked that about you." The prospect reached into his jacket, slowly, showing he wasn't looking for trouble yet, and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. "Mind if I smoke? It's been a long ride." Jake nodded, using the time to scan the tree line while Diesel lit up. One bike, one rider, no backup visible. Either the kid was supremely confident or supremely stupid. Maybe both. "Sweet little setup you got here," Diesel said, exhaling smoke. "Real peaceful. Must be nice, having all this quiet to think, to remember, get to the point." "The point is, brother, that some people in the organization have questions about Denver, about what happened to Mickey and why their star enforcer suddenly decided to become a carpenter." Diesel's smile never wavered, but his eyes went cold about whether that enforcer might be thinking of sharing any interesting stories with interested parties. "I don't talk to cops." "No? What about federal agents, DEA, ATF? Lots of alphabet soup out there, all very interested in our business activities." Diesel took another drag. "Word is, you might be feeling chatty. Looking to make deals, Jake felt the familiar weight of violence settling on his shoulders like an old coat. Word from who? Does it matter? Point is, the club's got concerns. And when the club has concerns... Diesel shrugged, letting the implication hang in the air. They send a prospect to handle it. For the first time, Diesel's composure cracked slightly. I earned my place. By kissing Vince Torino's ass? By running his errands? Jake stepped closer, watching the kid's hand drift toward his waistband. You think because you got some patches, you're a player now? I think you're a washed-up has-been hiding in the woods. Diesel's voice went tight. And I think the club wants to make sure you stay quiet. And if I don't? The prospect smiled again, but there was nothing friendly in it now. Then your little construction project here might have some accidents. Foundation work's dangerous. Lots of ways a man can get hurt out here in the middle of nowhere. Jake felt the rage building, the old familiar fire that had made him so effective in his previous life. It would be easy. 3 quick steps, snap the kid's neck, dump the body and the bike in the river. Clean and simple, but that was the old Jake. The one who'd left nothing but ash and blood in his wake. I'll think about it, he said instead. Diesel seemed surprised by the calm response. He'd been expecting threats, maybe violence. The old Jake would have given him both. Smart man. I'll be in touch. The prospect flicked his cigarette into the dirt and walked back to his bike. Real soon. The Harley roared to life, and Diesel threw a mock salute before disappearing back into the trees. Jake stood alone in the clearing, surrounded by the scattered tools and materials of his new life, and felt the past reaching out with bloody fingers to drag him back into the darkness. The metal box sat heavy in Jake's lap as dawn broke through the cabin windows, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn floorboards. His grandfather's final secret weighed more than its physical mass. Inside lay documents that could reshape everything he thought he knew about Thomas Rourke. Property deeds dated back 40 years, revealed land holdings scattered across 3 counties. Not just the cabin and its surrounding acres, but warehouses, storage facilities, and what appeared to be a network of safe houses. Each deed bore his grandfather's signature, but under different names. Thomas Mitchell, Thomas Reynolds, Thomas Kane. Jake's hands trembled as he unfolded a yellowed letter addressed to him, dated just months before the old man's death. The familiar scratchy handwriting made his throat tighten. If you're reading this, boy, then trouble found you like I always knew it would. The Rourke blood runs hot, and hot blood makes enemies. What I never told you about my younger days might surprise you. Before I was your quiet grandfather fixing engines and telling stories, I ran with men who lived outside the law. Different times, different wars, but the same brotherhood you found with your angels. Jake paused, processing the revelation. His grandfather, an outlaw? The man who'd taught him to whittle and respect the land? I made my share of enemies too, made mistakes that cost good men their lives. So I disappeared, took Sarah to these mountains, and buried Thomas Rourke so deep I almost forgot he existed. But I never forgot the lessons learned in blood and betrayal. Everything I built, every contingency I planned, was for the family I prayed would never need it. The letter continued with detailed instructions. Hidden weapons caches marked on hand-drawn maps, financial accounts under assumed names, contacts who owed old debts to Thomas Rourke, men who'd honor those debts to his grandson. The serpents aren't your only problem, Jake. Digging deeper into Mickey Chen's operation, you'll find connections that run all the way to the state capital. Chen's got police, judges, and politicians in his pocket. You can't fight this war with honor and expect to win. Sometimes a man has to become something darker to protect what matters. Jake set the letter aside and examined the remaining contents. Photographs showed his grandfather as a young man, leather-clad and dangerous-looking, standing beside motorcycles with other hard-faced men. In one image, Thomas Rourke posed next to a man Jake recognized from old newspaper clippings, Danny the Wolf Morrison, a notorious gang leader from the 70s who'd vanished without a trace. A knock on the cabin door made Jake freeze. 3 sharp raps, pause, 2 more. The pattern meant nothing to him, but instinct made him grab the pistol he'd taken from Chen's men. He approached the door cautiously. Jake Rourke. The voice was gravelly, aged but strong. I'm here about Thomas. Through the window, Jake saw an old man standing beside a vintage Harley, grey beard braided and hands scarred by decades of violence. He wore no colours but carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone who'd commanded respect in dangerous circles. Jake opened the door slowly, gun ready but not aimed. "Who's asking?" "Name's Bull Morrison. Your grandfather saved my brother's life in '74. When word spread that Thomas Rourke's grandson was in trouble with the serpents, I figured it was time to settle old debts." The surname clicked. Danny Morrison's brother. Jake studied the old man's face, seeing the same predatory intelligence that had marked the most dangerous angels he'd known. "My grandfather's been dead 2 years. "I know. Went to the funeral, though I stayed in the back. Thomas wanted it that way. Said his family didn't need to know about his past unless trouble came calling." Bull's eyes swept over Jake's battered face and bandaged hands. "Looks like trouble found you anyway." Jake stepped aside, letting Bull enter. The old man's gaze immediately went to the opened metal box, and his weathered face creased into something between a smile and a grimace. "He told you. Good. Means he trusted you to handle it right." Bull settled into a chair without invitation. "I've been watching the serpents expand their territory for months. Chen's getting bold, making moves that would have gotten him killed back in my day. Word is he hit your clubhouse, killed your brothers. All of them." Jake's voice came out flat, emotionless. "Then it's time to hit back, but not the way you're thinking. Not some suicidal assault that gets you dead and Chen victorious. Your grandfather learned from the best how to wage war from the shadows, how to make enemies destroy themselves." Bull reached into his jacket and produced a thick envelope. "Thomas asked me to give you this if you ever needed it. Names, addresses, and leverage on every corrupt official in Chen's network. Information gathered over 40 years of staying invisible but staying connected." Jake took the envelope, feeling its weight. "What's the catch?" "No catch, just a choice." Bull stood, his presence filling the small cabin. "You can stay up here, rebuild your life in peace like Thomas did. Or you can become what you need to become to finish this war, but know that once you cross that line, there's no going back to the man you were." The old man moved toward the door, then paused. "Thomas spent 40 years running from his past. Don't spend 40 years running from yours." The metal detector's steady beeping pulled Jake from his morning coffee. He'd been sweeping the property methodically for 3 days now, following the cryptic map his grandfather had left behind. Most hits turned out to be old nails or worthless scrap, but this signal felt different, stronger, more insistent. The device led him to a spot beneath what had been the cabin's back porch. Jake dropped to his knees and began digging with the small shovel he'd been carrying. 2 feet down, his blade struck something solid that definitely wasn't a rock. 20 minutes of careful excavation revealed a waterproof military surplus case, the kind designed to survive anything nature could throw at it. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he hauled it from the earth. The weight surprised him, at least 40 pounds of something that rattled when he shifted his grip. Inside the cabin, he set the case on his workbench and studied the combination lock. His grandfather had been predictable with numbers, always using dates that mattered. Jake tried his grandmother's birthday first, then his grandfather's military service dates. On the 4th attempt, using the coordinates from the map itself, the lock clicked open. The lid revealed layers of oiled cloth wrapped around objects of various sizes. Jake peeled back the first bundle to find 5 pristine handguns, 2 Colt 45 seconds, a Smith & Wesson 38, and a pair of Glock 19 seconds that looked fresh from the factory. Beneath the weapons, neat stacks of cash in vacuum-sealed bags caught the light. He didn't need to count to know there was serious money here. Tens of thousands, maybe more, but it was the bottom layer that made his blood run cold. Documents, photographs, and a leather journal filled with his grandfather's familiar handwriting. The first photo showed a much younger version of the old man standing next to 3 other men in military fatigues, automatic weapons slung across their chests. The background looked like jungle, Vietnam most likely. Jake flipped through more photos, his grandfather in civilian clothes, shaking hands with men in expensive suits, meeting in what looked like warehouses and shipping yards. Always in the shadows, always careful about angles and lighting, but the message was clear enough. His grandfather hadn't been the simple carpenter Jake remembered. The journal entries started in 1968 and continued sporadically through the decades. Jake read with growing disbelief as his grandfather chronicled a double life that spanned 40 years. Military connections that became criminal opportunities, smuggling operations that moved everything from weapons to drugs through the mountains of Northern California, names and dates and locations all documented in precise detail. "Christ, old man," Jake muttered, sinking into a chair. "What the hell were you into?" One entry from 1985 made him pause. "The boy asks too many questions about why people visit the cabin at odd hours. Told him they're hunting clients who prefer privacy. He seems satisfied with that explanation. Some secrets are better left buried until a man is ready to handle the weight of them." The boy. Jake realized his grandfather had been talking about him. He kept reading, following a trail of criminal enterprise that would have impressed even his Hells Angels contacts. His grandfather had been careful, professional, and apparently very successful. The cash in the case represented just a fraction of profits that had been laundered through legitimate businesses across 3 counties. But it was the final entry that stopped Jake cold. February 2019. "The Diablos are moving in on our territory. Tommy thinks he can muscle in on operations we've been running for 30 years. He's wrong, but he's also connected enough to cause serious problems. If something happens to me, everything I've built dies with me unless Jake steps up. The boy has the skills and the temperament for this work, even if he doesn't know it yet. The question is whether he'll have the stomach for what needs to be done." Jake stared at the page, his grandfather's words echoing in his mind. The Diablos. The same gang that had destroyed his life, killed his brothers, burned everything he'd cared about to the ground. They hadn't just been expanding their territory, they'd been settling an old score with his family. A loose photograph fell from the journal's back pages. Jake picked it up and felt his world shift again. His grandfather stood in the center of a group of bikers, all wearing familiar leather cuts. But these weren't Hells Angels colors. These were something else entirely. Older patches, different symbols, a club Jake had never heard of. On the back of the photo, someone had written, "Desert Ghosts MC, Final Run, 1987. Jake had never heard his grandfather mention any motorcycle club. As far as he knew, the old man had barely tolerated Jake's involvement with the Hells Angels, but here was proof of a connection that ran deeper than blood. The sound of approaching motorcycles cut through his thoughts. Multiple bikes, moving fast up the mountain road. Jake quickly rewrapped the weapons and shoved everything back into the case. Whatever his grandfather's secrets meant, they would have to wait. Right now, he had visitors coming, and in his experience, unannounced visitors rarely brought good news. The lockbox felt heavier than it should have as Jake carried it back to the cabin. Inside, the documents rustled with each step, their secrets demanding attention he wasn't sure he was ready to give. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for him with skeletal fingers. He set the box on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long moment. Everything about his grandfather had been straightforward, or so he'd thought. The old man who'd taught him to fish, who'd carved wooden birds with gnarled hands, who'd died peacefully in his sleep 3 years ago. Now Jake wondered how much of that man had been real and how much had been carefully constructed theater. The first document he pulled out was a deed, not for this property, but for a warehouse in Oakland. Jake recognized the address. It sat in disputed territory between the Devil's Disciples and the Iron Wolves, a no-man's land that had claimed 3 lives in the past year alone. According to the paperwork, his grandfather had owned it outright since 1987. Beneath the deed lay a series of bank statements spanning 2 decades. The amounts made Jake's breath catch. Deposits ranging from $50,000 to $500,000, all marked with cryptic reference numbers. His grandfather, who'd lived modestly on what Jake assumed was a pension, had been moving serious money. A leather journal occupied the bottom of the box, its pages yellow with age. Jake opened it carefully, squinting at his grandfather's spidery handwriting. The entries were sparse but detailed. March 15, 1989. Shipment arrived from Tijuana. Quality acceptable. Distribution network expanding. June 3, 1991. Meeting with Chicago contacts. New routes through Nevada proving profitable. October 22, 1994. Close call with Federal Task Force. May need to lay low for 6 months. Jake's hands trembled as he turned the pages. His grandfather hadn't just been involved in organized crime, he'd been running a significant operation. The journal detailed drug shipments, money laundering schemes, and territorial arrangements that read like a playbook for everything Jake had learned in the Angels. But it was the final entry that made his blood run cold. Tommy Volkov. Jake knew that name intimately. It belonged to the Devil's Disciples' current president, the man who'd ordered the hit on Jake's crew. The nephew had to be Victor, Tommy's violent progeny who'd pulled the trigger on Sarah. The connection hit Jake like a physical blow. The attack on his crew hadn't been random gang warfare, it had been personal, rooted in his grandfather's past. Sarah had died because of secrets buried in these mountains, because of money and territory and grudges that predated Jake's existence in the criminal world. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. Outside, the wind had picked up, setting the trees to swaying. The rebuilt cabin suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. If the Volkovs had suspected his grandfather of hiding assets, they might come looking. They might already be on their way. Jake gathered the documents, his mind racing through possibilities. The warehouse deed alone was worth millions in the right hands, or the wrong ones. His grandfather's distribution network, if it still existed, could be leveraged for power or profit, but it could also be a death sentence for anyone foolish enough to try claiming it. A distant sound made him freeze, the low rumble of motorcycle engines, multiple bikes moving fast up the mountain road. Jake stuffed the papers back into the lockbox and carried it to the bedroom, sliding it under the loose floorboard where he'd found it. The hiding spot wouldn't fool a determined search, but it might buy him time. The engines grew louder, closer. Jake grabbed the Remington and checked the load, then moved to the front window. Through the trees he caught glimpses of chrome and leather, 4 bikes, maybe 5. They weren't wearing Angels' colors. The lead rider emerged into the clearing first, a massive man with a grey beard and Devil's Disciples patch prominent on his cut. Tommy Volkov himself, looking exactly like the mugshots Jake had studied during his years of planning revenge. Behind him rode Victor and 3 other prospects Jake didn't recognize. They stopped their bikes in a semicircle facing the cabin, engines idling. Tommy dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. For now. "Jacob Marshall," Tommy called out, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. "We need to talk. Your grandfather and I had some unfinished business, and I'm hoping you're a reasonable man who can help us settle things peacefully." Jake kept the rifle ready but stayed behind cover. The irony wasn't lost on him. The men he'd been hunting had come to him. But they held all the cards now, and they knew it. "What kind of business?" Jake shouted back. Tommy smiled, the expression cold as winter steel. "The kind that involves a very valuable piece of real estate and some money that's been missing for a long time." The sound of approaching motorcycles cut through the Montana morning like chainsaws through silence. Jake dropped his hammer and moved to the window, his hand instinctively reaching for the Glock tucked beneath his flannel shirt. 3 bikes crested the ridge, their chrome catching the early sunlight as they descended toward the cabin. He recognized the lead rider immediately, Tommy Tank Morrison, all 300 pounds of him squeezed into black leather, his beard streaked with gray that hadn't been there 2 years ago. Behind him rode 2 prospects Jake didn't recognize, young and hungry, looking with that particular brand of stupidity that got people killed. Jake stepped onto the porch, keeping his hands visible but ready. The bikes pulled up in a cloud of dust and diesel fumes, engines rumbling like caged beasts before falling silent. Tank removed his helmet, revealing a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and repeatedly beaten with the same chisel. "Well, I'll be damned," Tank said, his voice carrying the rasp of a lifetime smoker. "Jake fucking Brennan, playing house in the woods. Tank." Jake kept his voice neutral. "Long way from Tacoma. Not as far as you might think." Tank swung his massive leg over the bike. the suspension sighing with relief. Word travels fast in our line of work. Heard you'd gone native up here, building yourself a little hideaway. The prospects flanked Tank, trying to look intimidating. One had gang tattoos that were clearly fresh, the ink still holding that shop-bright quality. The other kept his hand near the pistol tucked into his waistband, telegraphing his intentions like a rookie poker player. "What do you want, Tank?" "Same thing I've always wanted, brother. Loyalty, respect, and answers." Tank's eyes swept over the half-finished cabin, taking in the neat stacks of lumber, the careful craftsmanship visible in every joint and beam. "Nice work. Always knew you had good hands. Shame to see 'em wasted on carpentry when there's real work to be done." Jake felt the familiar weight of his past settling over him like a lead blanket. "I'm retired. Funny thing about retirement in our business, it's not really voluntary." Tank pulled a cigarette from his vest pocket, taking his time lighting it. "See, Marcus sends his regards, along with a job offer." The name hit Jake like a physical blow. Marcus Volkov, the Russian who'd orchestrated his fall from grace, who'd turned his own brothers against him and left him for dead in that warehouse in Seattle. The man who'd taken everything from him, his club, his family, his identity. "Marcus is dead," Jake said flatly. Reports of his death were greatly exaggerated. Tank took a long drag, exhaling smoke into the crisp mountain air. "Turns out he's been very much alive, and very much interested in your whereabouts. Seems you two have some unfinished business." The prospect with the fresh tattoos shifted nervously, his eyes darting between Jake and the tree line. Smart kid. He could sense the tension ratcheting up like a wire about to snap. The other one was still playing with his gun, too stupid to realize he was already dead if this went sideways. "Here's how it works," Tank continued. "You come back with us, nice and peaceful. Have a conversation with Marcus, settle whatever needs settling. Maybe even get your patch back, if you play it right. And if I don't?" Tank's smile was all teeth and malice. "Then we burn this place down and drag you back anyway. Your choice how much blood gets spilled in the process." Jake's mind raced through possibilities, calculating angles and distances. The prospect on the left was maybe 20 feet away, the one on the right slightly closer. Tank was the real threat. He'd been in this game longer than either of them had been alive, and his reputation for violence was well earned. But he was also older, slower, and carrying at least 50 pounds more weight than his body was designed for. "You know what the difference is between you and me, Tank?" Jake asked, his hand moving slowly toward his weapon. "Enlighten me." "You're still living in the past, still thinking like a soldier in someone else's war." Jake's fingers found the grip of the Glock. "But I've been learning something up here. Sometimes the only way to build something new is to burn down what came before." Tank's eyes widened as he realized Jake's intent, his own hand reaching for the .45 holstered beneath his arm. But Jake was already moving, muscle memory and 2 years of pent-up rage driving his actions. The Glock cleared leather as the first shots rang out across the valley, shattering the peaceful morning like glass. Birds exploded from the trees in panicked flight as gunfire echoed off the mountainsides. The war Jake had tried so hard to leave behind had finally found him, and now there was nowhere left to run. The only way out was through, and through meant blood. The morning sun cast long shadows through the pines as Jake finished loading supplies into the truck bed. 3 weeks of hard labor had transformed the skeletal remains of his grandfather's cabin into something resembling home again. New walls stood straight and true, a metal roof gleamed silver against the green canopy, and the smell of fresh lumber had replaced the acrid stench of ash. Sarah emerged from the rebuilt structure carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing one of his old flannel shirts. The sight of her in his clothes, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, stirred something protective and tender in his chest. She'd stayed every night since their first kiss, helping him rebuild more than just walls and floors. "You sure about heading into town?" she asked, handing him the thermos. "We've got enough food for another few days." Jake accepted the coffee, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "Need to pick up the generator and get more insulation before the next storm rolls in. Weather radio says we've got maybe 2 days of clear skies left." What he didn't mention was the unease that had been gnawing at him for the past week. Twice now, He'd found tire tracks on the old logging road that led to the property, tracks that didn't match Sarah's Toyota or his own truck. The practical side of his mind insisted it could be hunters or Forest Service personnel, but 20 years in the Angels had taught him to trust his instincts over logic. Sarah studied his face with those sharp green eyes that seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed calm. "You're worried about something?" It wasn't a question. Jake took a long sip of coffee, buying himself time. He'd promised her honesty, but the truth carried weight he wasn't sure she was ready to bear. The betrayal that had destroyed his old life hadn't just cost him his brothers and his standing in the club. It had painted a target on his back that distance and good intentions couldn't erase. "Just want to get the place winterized before the weather turns," he said finally. She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the soap on her skin and see the flecks of gold in her eyes. "Jake Torino, I've seen you face down drunk loggers twice your size without breaking a sweat. Whatever's got you spooked, it's not the weather forecast." The sound of his full name on her lips sent a chill down his spine. He'd been careful to keep those two worlds separate, the man he'd been and the man he was trying to become. But Sarah had a way of seeing connections others missed, of pulling threads until the whole tapestry came unraveled. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Known what, exactly?" "Don't play games with me, Sarah. You just called me by a name I never told you." She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze steady on his face. When she spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "I started putting pieces together after that night at Murphy's. The way those men backed down when they saw you, the scars, the fact that you paid cash for thousands of dollars worth of building supplies but don't seem to have any visible means of income." Jake felt the familiar weight of his past settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. And I did some research. Jacob Torino, former Sergeant-at-Arms for the Northern California chapter of the Hells Angels. Arrested twice, convicted never. Suspected of involvement in everything from gun running to extortion to murder. She paused, watching his reaction. Reported missing and presumed dead 6 months ago after a warehouse fire in Oakland that killed 3 people. The coffee turned bitter in his mouth. "If you know all that, why are you still here?" "Because I also know that you spent the last 3 weeks building shelter for injured wildlife. Because you won't even kill the spiders in the bathroom, just catches them and puts them outside. Because when you think I'm sleeping, you have nightmares that make you cry out in your sleep." Jake set down the thermos with hands that had started to shake. The careful walls he'd built around his new life were crumbling, exposing the raw wounds beneath. "You don't understand what you're getting into. The people I used to run with, the enemies I made, they don't believe in fresh starts or second chances. They believe in blood debts and final payments." Sarah reached up and cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Then we'll face it together. This isn't some romantic adventure, Sarah. These people will hurt you to get to me. They'll burn down everything we've built here just to watch me suffer." "Maybe," she said, "but running away won't change that. And I'd rather stand my ground next to someone I love than spend my life wondering what might have been." The word hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning 2 different worlds. Love, simple and complicated, offering salvation and damnation in equal measure. The morning brought an unexpected visitor. Marcus watched through the cabin's new front window as a black sedan navigated the rutted dirt road, its undercarriage scraping against the rocky terrain. The car was all wrong for these mountains. Too low, too clean, too expensive. He set down his coffee and moved to the gun cabinet, retrieving the Remington his grandfather had used for hunting. The sedan pulled to a stop beside his Harley. A woman emerged from the driver's side, moving with the calculated grace of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. She wore dark jeans and a leather jacket, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Even from a distance, Marcus could see the bulge of a shoulder holster beneath her jacket. She approached the cabin with her hands visible, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "Marcus Stone? Depends who's asking." He stepped onto the porch, rifle held loosely but ready. "Special Agent Sarah Chen, FBI." She reached slowly into her jacket and produced a badge. "I need to talk to you about the Crimson Tide." Marcus felt his blood chill. The Crimson Tide was the gang that had destroyed his life, killed his brothers, burned everything he'd built. But why would the FBI be interested now? They're all dead, he said flatly. Case closed. That's what we thought too. Chen took a careful step closer, until 3 days ago when Dmitry Volkov was spotted in Seattle. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Dmitry Volkov, the Crimson Tide's enforcer, the man who'd put a bullet in Tommy's head while Marcus was forced to watch. He'd been certain Volkov died in the warehouse fire that ended their war. You're lying. I wish I was. Chen reached into her other pocket and pulled out a photograph, holding it up for him to see. Even from the porch, Marcus could make out the distinctive spiderweb tattoo that covered the left side of Volkov's face. Surveillance photo from 2 days ago. He's been asking questions about you. Marcus lowered the rifle. His mind raced through the implications. If Volkov was alive, then others might be too. The war he thought was over could be just beginning again. What do you want from me? Information. Cooperation. Chen climbed the porch steps slowly. Volkov's been recruiting, building something new. We think he's planning something big, and you're the only person alive who knows how he operates. I'm retired. Are you? She gestured toward the cabin. Because from what I've heard, you've been quite busy. The Ramirez cartel sends their regards, by the way. Apparently you cost them a very profitable operation. Marcus studied her face, looking for tells. FBI agents didn't usually work alone, especially not in situations like this. Where's your partner? This conversation isn't officially happening. Chen leaned against the porch railing. The Bureau thinks you're dead. Your club's records list you as killed in action 18 months ago. Far as the government's concerned, Marcus Stone doesn't exist anymore. Smart of them. Except now we need Marcus Stone. She pulled out another photograph, this one showing a young girl, maybe 8 years old, with bright eyes and pigtails. This is my niece, Annie. She goes to Roosevelt Elementary in Seattle, same school that Volkov was photographed watching. The implication hung in the air between them like smoke. Marcus had seen Volkov's handiwork before. The man had no boundaries, no lines he wouldn't cross. Using children as leverage was well within his playbook. He doesn't know you're FBI? Not yet, but he's been tracking down everyone connected to the old war. Your name came up, a lot. Chen's voice carried a note of desperation she was trying to hide. He's going to figure out my connection eventually. Marcus set the rifle aside and sat down on the porch steps. The morning sun felt warm on his face, but he couldn't shake the chill that had settled in his bones. He'd come to these mountains to escape this life, to build something clean and peaceful. Now the past was reaching out with bloody fingers to drag him back. What exactly are you asking me to do? Help us find him, before he finds you. Chen sat down beside him, her professional facade cracking slightly. We know he's building towards something. The recruiting, the surveillance, the questions about you, it's all connected. But we can't see the pattern. And you think I can? I think you know him better than anyone alive. You fought him for 3 years. You survived when everyone else died. She turned to face him directly. I think you're the only chance my niece has. Marcus looked out over the mountains, watching an eagle circle high above the tree line. 3 months ago, he would have already been loading his bike. The old Marcus Stone would have ridden straight into hell for the chance to finish Volkov permanently. But that Marcus Stone had died in these mountains and been reborn as something different. The question was, which man would Dmitry Volkov face when he came calling? The serpents arrived at dawn like a plague of locusts, their bikes cutting through the mountain silence with mechanical fury. Jake watched from his concealed position behind the ridge, counting heads through his grandfather's old hunting scope. 12 riders, maybe more, scattered through the trees below. Tommy the Tank Morrison led the pack, his massive frame unmistakable even at this distance. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the leather pouch containing his grandfather's journal. The final entries had revealed everything, coordinates to 3 separate caches hidden throughout these mountains, each containing enough weapons and ammunition to outfit a small army. His grandfather hadn't just been preparing for some abstract future conflict. He'd been preparing for this exact moment, as if he'd somehow known his grandson would one day need to make a final stand against impossible odds. The first cache lay hidden beneath the old mining equipment near Copper Creek, a 20-minute hike down the eastern slope. Jake had memorized every detail from the journal's cryptic descriptions. 30 paces from the rusted ore cart, due north to the lightning-split pine, then west until you found the boulder shaped like a sleeping bear. His grandfather's wartime paranoia had seemed excessive when Jake first read those pages. Now it felt like divine providence. He belly-crawled backward from the ridgeline, keeping low until the terrain provided better cover. The serpents would expect him to fort up in the rebuilt cabin, maybe try to pick them off from the windows like some cornered animal. They'd be wrong. His grandfather had taught him better through those journal pages. Never fight from a fixed position when you're outnumbered. Never give your enemy the advantage of knowing where you'll be next. The hike to Copper Creek pushed his healing ribs to their limit, each jarring step sending fresh waves of pain through his torso. But pain was just information now, data to be processed and filed away. The cache was exactly where the journal promised, hidden beneath a camouflaged steel plate that looked like nothing more than another piece of discarded mining debris. Jake's breath caught as he lifted the heavy cover. 4 military-grade assault rifles lay wrapped in oiled canvas, along with enough ammunition to siege a city block. Grenades nestled in custom foam cutouts like deadly eggs. But it was the sniper rifle that made his pulse quicken, a Barrett M82, a one that had probably cost more than most people's cars. His grandfather's faded handwriting on a piece of masking tape read for the wolves that come in packs. The sound of engines echoing off the canyon walls told him the serpents had reached the cabin. Jake worked quickly, loading magazines and checking the rifle's scope. His grandfather had maintained everything perfectly despite decades of storage. Even the ammunition looked factory fresh. He made his way to higher ground, following game trails that his grandfather's journal had mapped with military precision. The old man had turned these entire mountains into a fortress, complete with prepared fighting positions and predetermined fields of fire. Each location offered multiple escape routes, multiple angles of attack. From his new vantage point, Jake could see the serpents had indeed surrounded his cabin. They moved with the clumsy confidence of men who believed overwhelming numbers guaranteed victory. Tommy Morrison stood near the rebuilt porch, shouting orders and gesturing toward the windows. 3 serpents kicked in the front door, while others took positions behind trees and boulders. Jake settled the Barrett stock against his shoulder, feeling the weapon's substantial weight ground him to the earth. His grandfather's voice seemed to whisper from the pages of that journal, "Patience chooses the moment. Anger wastes it." The first shot took out Tommy's lieutenant, a wiry psychopath named Razor who'd been circling toward the cabin's rear entrance. The heavy rifle's report echoed like thunder through the canyon, sending the remaining serpents scrambling for better cover. But his grandfather's positioning was too good. Every piece of available cover down there left something exposed. The second shot shattered Tommy Morrison's left kneecap, dropping the massive enforcer like a felled tree. Jake could have killed him cleanly, but death was too quick for what Tommy had done to Maria, to his club brothers, to everything Jake had once called family. Chaos erupted below as the serpents tried to locate his position. They fired wild bursts into the tree line, wasting ammunition and revealing their locations with muzzle flashes. Jake methodically worked his way through predetermined targets, his grandfather's tactical wisdom guiding each shot. By the time the sun reached its zenith, half the serpents lay dead or wounded among the trees. The survivors had retreated to a defensive cluster near their bikes, but Jake's elevated position left them nowhere to hide effectively. His radio crackled, Tommy Morrison's voice weak with pain and rage. "This ain't over, Steele. You can't hide up there forever." Jake keyed his response, his grandfather's final lesson echoing in his mind. "Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted, Tommy. Today you learn the difference." The morning sun filtered through the pine trees as Jake loaded the last of his grandfather's journals into the saddlebags of his Harley. 3 weeks had passed since the showdown with the serpents, and the cabin stood rebuilt, stronger than before. But something had changed in him during those long nights reading his grandfather's words, understanding the weight of the legacy that had been passed down. Marcus emerged from the cabin, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. His arm was still in a sling from the firefight, but he'd refused to leave until Jake made his decision about what came next. "You sure about this?" Marcus asked, handing him a cup. Jake took a long sip, savoring the bitter warmth. "The journals make it clear, brother. There are 3 more caches scattered across the country, places where my grandfather stored not just gold, but information, names, dates, connections that go back decades. Could be dangerous. Some of those names might still be alive, still have power. That's exactly why I need to find them." Jake's voice carried a conviction that hadn't been there months ago. My grandfather wasn't just some old prospector, he was documenting corruption, building a case that could bring down networks that had been operating for 50 years. The sound of approaching motorcycles rumbled through the forest. Jake tensed instinctively, but Marcus held up his good hand. "Relax. That's our ride." 3 bikes emerged from the tree line. Bear, Tommy, and surprisingly, Sarah Chen, the federal agent who'd helped coordinate the takedown of the serpents. She'd traded her standard-issue vehicle for a sleek black Yamaha. "Didn't expect to see you here," Jake said as she removed her helmet. "After what we found in Victor's compound, my superiors are very interested in those journals," she replied. "The serpents were just the tip of the iceberg. The financial records we recovered show connections to trafficking networks across 3 states. Bear dismounted his bike with a grunt. "Told you this wasn't over when we put Victor in the ground. The question is," Sarah continued, "are you willing to work with us officially? What your grandfather documented could help us dismantle operations that have been untouchable for decades." Jake looked around at the faces watching him. Marcus with his unwavering loyalty, Bear who'd become like family, Tommy still eager to prove himself, and Sarah representing a world he'd never trusted, but was starting to understand might be necessary. "There's something else," Jake said finally. "The last entry in my grandfather's journal. He mentions a name, someone he called the Architect, someone who's been coordinating between legitimate business, organized crime, and corrupt officials for 30 years. Sarah's expression sharpened. "Did he identify this person?" "Not directly, but he left clues. 3 locations where he hid evidence, and a warning that the Architect has people everywhere, law enforcement, government, even in organizations like mine." The weight of what Jake was proposing settled over the group. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, or even justice for his grandfather. It was about something much larger. "So we're talking about a road trip," Tommy said, trying to lighten the mood. "I'm in." Marcus shook his head. "This isn't some adventure, kid. If Jake's right, we'll be going up against people with resources we can't imagine, people who've killed to protect their secrets. Which is why we do this smart," Sarah interjected. "Official backing, proper resources, but small team, mobile and hard to track." Jake walked to the edge of the clearing, looking out over the valley where he'd found peace these past months. Part of him wanted to stay, to live quietly with the gold he'd already recovered and let the past remain buried. But his grandfather's words echoed in his memory. "Some fights choose you, regardless of whether you want them." "The first cache is in Montana," he said, turning back to the group. "According to the journal, it's hidden in an abandoned copper mine outside Butte. If we're going to do this, we start there." "When do we leave?" Bear asked. "Tomorrow at dawn. We travel light, stay off main highways when possible. Sarah, you'll need to coordinate with your people, but keep the circle small. If the Architect really has the reach my grandfather believed, we can't trust anyone we don't absolutely have to." As the afternoon wore on, they planned routes and contingencies. Jake found himself thinking about Maria, about the life he'd lost and the man he'd been before everything fell apart. That Jake had been driven by rage and loyalty to a code that ultimately betrayed him. This Jake, shaped by solitude, loss, and his grandfather's wisdom, understood that some things were worth fighting for beyond personal vengeance. The sun was setting when the others finally departed, leaving Jake alone with the rebuilt cabin and the weight of what lay ahead. He placed his hand on the rough-hewn log walls, feeling the strength of what they'd built together. Tomorrow, the real journey would begin. The helicopter's rotors cut through the morning air like a death song, growing louder with each second. Marcus dropped his axe and sprinted toward the cabin, his boots pounding against the frost-hardened ground. Through the kitchen window, he could see Sarah grabbing the emergency pack they'd prepared: water, first aid, ammunition, and the burner phone he'd hoped never to use. "North Ridge!" he shouted as she burst through the door. "There's a cave system about 2 miles up." You remember the trail? She nodded, slinging the pack over her shoulder. Her face was pale but determined, the fear in her eyes tempered by the same steel that had kept her alive through years of surviving her father's violence. What about you? I'll buy you time. Get moving. The helicopter crested the tree line, black against the pewter sky. Marcus recognized the model, a Bell 429, fast and maneuverable. Not military, but not some amateur operation either. Jake had brought serious firepower to Montana. Sarah hesitated at the cabin's edge. Marcus, go, now. She disappeared into the timber as the helicopter began its descent toward the clearing. Marcus retreated into the cabin, moving with practiced efficiency. He grabbed the AR-15 from behind the wood stove and checked the magazine. 30 rounds. The Glock went into his waistband, along with 2 spare clips. From the kitchen drawer, he pulled out the radio detonator for the charges he'd planted around the property's perimeter 3 days ago, insurance he'd prayed he wouldn't need. The helicopter touched down in the meadow, rotors still spinning. Through the window, Marcus counted 4 figures emerging from the aircraft. They moved like professionals, weapons ready, coordinating with hand signals. Jake's voice carried across the distance, barking orders that were lost in the rotor wash. Marcus smiled grimly. Let them come. He fired the first shot through the kitchen window, the bullet sparking off the helicopter's fuselage. The assault team immediately scattered, seeking cover behind fallen logs and rock outcroppings. Good. The longer they stayed bunched up near the landing zone, the better his chances. Return fire shattered the cabin's front windows. Marcus had already moved, circling to the back door. He knew this terrain like a prayer. Every tree and stone memorized during months of careful preparation. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. A smart man doesn't fight fair, boy. He fights to win. The radio detonator felt solid in his palm as he pressed the first button. The explosion erupted from the tree line to the east, sending dirt and debris fountaining into the air. The assault team reflexively turned toward the blast, giving Marcus the opening he needed. He sprinted from the cabin's rear, using the smoke as cover, and reached the woodshed before they could reorient. "Contact rear!" someone shouted. Marcus triggered the second charge. This one was closer to the helicopter, planted near the edge of the meadow. The pilot, who'd been keeping the rotors spinning for a quick extraction, suddenly found himself dealing with flying rocks and burning vegetation. The aircraft lurched sideways as he fought for control. Through the chaos, Marcus caught sight of Jake Torino himself, crouched behind a granite boulder 30 yards away. The man looked older than Marcus remembered. His dark hair shot through with silver, but his movements still carried the predatory grace that had made him legend among the angels. Their eyes met across the smoky battlefield, and Jake's lips curved into something that might have been a smile. The third charge was the big one, planted directly beneath the helicopter-esque landing zone on a timer Marcus had triggered with the first detonation. He counted down in his head as bullets chewed bark from the pine tree beside him. 5, 4, 3, 2. The blast lifted the helicopter 3 feet off the ground before slamming it back down. The main rotor shattered, sending metal fragments spinning through the air like deadly confetti. The fuel tank caught, turning the aircraft into a pillar of black smoke and orange flame. "Son of a bitch!" Jake's voice cut through the noise. "You always were too clever for your own good, Marcus." "Funny," Marcus called back, ejecting his spent magazine and slamming in a fresh one. "That's exactly what I was thinking about you." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling flames and the distant sound of sirens, the Forest Service fire crew, most likely, responding to reports of the explosion. Marcus had maybe 10 minutes before this place became a circus of emergency vehicles and federal investigators. Jake seemed to realize it too. "You can't run forever, brother. We'll find you again. Maybe, but not today." Marcus triggered the final charge, planted along the access road. The explosion brought down 3 large pines, effectively blocking the only vehicle route to the cabin. Anyone wanting to leave would be walking out through rough country. He melted back into the forest, following Sarah's trail toward the high country, leaving behind the burning wreckage of his carefully rebuilt life and the ghosts that refused to stay buried. The morning air carried the scent of pine and possibility, As Marcus stood before the completed cabin, his grandfather's journal clutched in his weathered hands. 3 months of rebuilding had transformed the charred ruins into something more beautiful than what had been destroyed. The new structure honored the old while embracing the future. Wider windows to let in more light, a reinforced foundation that could weather any storm, and hidden compartments where the most precious things could be safely kept. Sarah emerged from the cabin carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee, her hair catching the early sunlight. She'd stayed through it all, watching him transform from a broken man seeking vengeance into someone who understood that true strength came from building rather than destroying. The legal work was nearly finished. The properties his grandfather had secretly accumulated over decades were being transferred into a trust that would help other veterans find their way back from the darkness. "The lawyer called," she said, settling beside him on the new porch steps. "The last of the paperwork goes through today. 23 properties across 4 states, all free and clear. Your grandfather was quite the businessman." Marcus nodded, still amazed by the old man's foresight. The journal had revealed not just the locations of hidden caches, but a carefully orchestrated plan spanning 40 years. Every dollar earned from small real estate investments, every modest property purchased in towns where veterans might need a fresh start. His grandfather had built an empire of second chances, waiting for the right person to inherit not just the wealth, but the responsibility. The sound of motorcycles approaching made them both tense, old habits dying hard. But these weren't the Reapers or any other club looking for trouble. Jake pulled up first, his bike gleaming in the morning sun, followed by 3 other riders Marcus had come to trust over the past month. Former military, all of them, men who'd found their way to the mountains seeking the same thing Marcus had found, a chance to rebuild. "Ready for this?" Jake asked, removing his helmet. He'd been the first to respond when Marcus had quietly put out word about what they were planning. A brotherhood built on healing rather than retribution, on protecting rather than praying. Marcus stood, feeling the weight of leadership settling differently on his shoulders than it had in his Hell's Angels days. This wasn't about territory or respect earned through fear. This was about men who'd served their country, finding a way to serve each other, using the resources his grandfather had left to create something that mattered. "The first house is in Billings," Marcus said, consulting the journal one last time before closing it. "Vietnam vet, lost his disability payments to bureaucratic red tape. Been living in his truck for 6 months. "And the others?" asked Tommy, the youngest of the group, barely out of his 20s but carrying the invisible wounds of 3 tours overseas. 12 more situations we can address immediately," Sarah answered, consulting her own notes. "I've been working with VA advocates and homeless shelters to identify the most urgent cases, men and women who just need a stable place to land while they get back on their feet." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus, that he was using skills learned in a criminal organization to coordinate something entirely legal and beneficial. The logistics of moving resources quickly and quietly, the network of trusted contacts, the ability to operate under the radar when necessary. All of it translated perfectly to their new mission. His phone buzzed with a text message that made him smile. Detective Rodriguez had sent a photo from the courthouse where the last of the Reapers were being sentenced. The conspiracy had unraveled completely once members started talking, each looking to minimize their own sentences by giving up the others. The man who'd ordered the hit on Marcus's family would spend the rest of his life in prison, along with most of his leadership. But Marcus felt no satisfaction from their downfall. That part of his life was finished. The need for vengeance burned away like the original cabin had been. What rose from those ashes was something his grandfather would have recognized, a mission that honored the values they'd both served, even when Marcus had lost his way for so many years. "We should go," he said finally, pocketing the phone and walking toward his own bike. The Harley was the same one he'd ridden into the mountains broken and alone, but like everything else, it had been transformed. The club patches were gone, replaced with a simple emblem they'd designed together, a pine tree growing from rocky ground, roots deep and branches reaching toward light. Sarah kissed him goodbye, promising to coordinate with the legal team while they handled the first of what would be many missions. As the 4 motorcycles rolled down the mountain road, Marcus felt his grandfather riding alongside them, finally at peace, knowing the treasures he'd hidden had found their way into the right hands. The real inheritance hadn't been the gold or the properties or even the cabin itself. It had been the understanding that a man's true worth was measured by what he built for others, not what he took for himself. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rebuilt cabin as Jake hammered the final nail into the front porch railing. The wood was fresh pine, still bleeding sap, but it would weather and strengthen with time. Like everything else up here, he thought, including himself. 3 months had passed since the shootout that left Snake and his crew scattered to the winds. The FBI had cleaned up the mess, and Jake's cooperation had earned him something he'd never expected, a clean slate. No charges, no warrants, just a chance to disappear into the life he was already building. The cabin stood complete now, larger than his grandfather's original structure, but built with the same careful attention to detail. Solar panels gleamed on the south-facing roof, and a modern well pump hummed quietly beside the old hand-dug foundation. Jake had kept some of the old man's touches, the stone fireplace rebuilt with the same river rocks, the covered porch facing east to catch the sunrise. A truck engine echoed up the valley road, and Jake looked up to see Deputy Martinez's patrol vehicle climbing the switchbacks. They'd developed an unlikely friendship over the past months, built on mutual respect and shared coffee on quiet mornings when Martinez made his rounds. "Morning, Jake," Martinez called as he climbed out of his cruiser. "Cabin's looking good." "She's finished," Jake said, setting down his hammer. "At least the bones of her, always more work to do, but she's livable." Martinez nodded, his eyes scanning the property. "Got some news you might want to hear." Word came down from Denver. They found Trigger Rodriguez in a motel outside Phoenix. Seems he couldn't handle civilian life. Tried to rob a convenience store with a rusty knife. Jake felt something twist in his chest. Trigger had been young, maybe 25, recruited into the Angels straight from county lockup. Another kid who'd never learned there was anything else. He okay? Alive. Looking at 5 to 10, but alive. Martinez studied Jake's face. "You thinking about visiting?" "Maybe, when he's ready." Jake picked up his coffee mug from the porch railing. Strange how it all works out. I spent 15 years thinking the club was family, but I never knew any of those boys. Not really. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals that rose from the warming valley floor. Jake watched it hunt, patient and purposeful, and remembered his grandfather's words about the difference between surviving and living. "You planning to stay up here permanent?" Martinez asked. Jake had been asking himself the same question. The cabin was finished, his savings nearly depleted, and winter was still months away. He'd need work soon, real work that brought in steady money. But the thought of leaving this valley, even temporarily, felt like tearing something inside himself. "Been thinking about that," Jake admitted. "Mrs. Henderson down in town mentioned the Forest Service is hiring seasonal rangers. Good benefits, outdoor work. You'd be good at it. Know the country, know people." Martinez grinned. "Plus, you've got experience dealing with troublemakers." They shared a laugh, easy and comfortable. It struck Jake how foreign this felt, standing on his own land, talking with a friend about ordinary things like jobs and weather and the future. For most of his adult life, conversations had been about territory and debts and which enemies needed watching. This was better. After Martinez left, Jake walked down to the creek that bordered his property. The water ran clear and cold, tumbling over granite stones his grandfather had probably skipped as a boy. He pulled out his phone, a new one legitimately purchased under his real name, and scrolled through his contacts. There weren't many. Martinez, the hardware store in town, a few contractors he'd hired for electrical work, but at the bottom of the list was a number he'd added last week: Montana Veterans Services. The counselor there, a former Marine named Patterson, had mentioned job placement programs for vets transitioning to civilian life. Jake stared at the number for a long moment, then hit call. "Patterson here. This is Jake Murphy. We talked last week about the Forest Service positions. Jake, good to hear from you. You ready to move forward with the application?" "Yeah," Jake said, surprising himself with how certain he sounded. "I'm ready." They talked for 20 minutes about requirements and training schedules and starting dates. When Jake hung up, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, anticipation for tomorrow that didn't involve watching his back or calculating angles. The sun climbed higher, warming the valley and drawing the sweet smell of pine sap from the cabin's fresh lumber. Jake walked back up the slope to his porch, his boots solid on the wooden steps he'd cut and fitted himself. Inside, he poured fresh coffee and sat at the kitchen table his grandfather had built 60 years ago. Through the window, he could see the entire valley spreading below him, wild, clean, and his to protect. Home, he thought. Finally home.